Sounds like Europe. Cross-border podcasting.
Hello and welcome to the last episode of the first season of Sounds Like Europe, Cross-Border Podcasting, a project brought to you by Wipod. I am your host, Javi Caminero. The rise of podcasts in recent years has led to the exploration of new narratives and formats. Because of this, it is increasingly common to find podcasts that record their episodes with a live audience. Conversational podcasts are, without a doubt, the genre in which the presence of an audience works best. There are more and more podcasts right now with a huge fanbase, and they try to take advantage of this by involving their audience and making them part of their recordings. Having an audience at podcast recordings is a resource usually used for special episodes. We're talking about a Christmas special or maybe a season finale, but it has also become the hallmark, a constant feature in several podcasts. For example, one of the most successful podcasts right now here in Spain, La Ruina, emphasizes the presence and participation of the audience in its recordings. Involving the audience in a podcast makes it unique, but also unpredictable. Therefore, producing this kind of podcast is not an easy task. So, to further explore this issue, I'm joined today by Fanny Cohen Moreau, a French journalist and podcast producer. Hello, Fanny, how are you?
Hello, Javier. I'm very fine, despite it's finally hot in France also. So we are very happy to get out of the winter.
First of all, Fanny, tell me and the audience your story. What's your relationship with podcasting and what's your experience working on podcasts with live audiences?
Because I have a formation in journalism and history. And 7 years ago, and also I worked on a lot of public radio in France, like France Inter. I was doing some radio shows, like producing and doing the technical part. And 7 years ago, I had this strange idea. So why not? I'm doing a podcast about research in medieval history, because I did studies in medieval history, and I was studying the thing about that. In the radio and TV, we listened a lot about historians, but they're all, how to say it, nice way, quite old, and sometimes it's an ancient version of history. I wanted the young generation of historians to be heard. And about live audience, I used to play theater, so I was used to have an audience, but not with podcast. And I did my first live audience with podcasting was for the first anniversary of my podcast Passion Médiéviste. Because I didn't know why, I was so happy that my podcast was 1 year. Whoa, so happy. And I say, okay, let's do a live audience with all my previous guests. And now it's 7 years later and I'm still doing it. I love it.
And why would a podcast record an episode with a live audience? What do you think the audience brings to the recording of a podcast?
Because I think for a podcast, it's first, it's one way to meet the audience. Because everybody know when we are doing a podcast, it's sometimes we are very alone. Sometimes doing the recording, doing all the research, producing, and first of all, to meet the audience, it's very. Grateful. We are very grateful to meet the audience. So first of all, I love doing this for that, and you get a unique experience. Like for the audience, is to see in live what's going on, because a lot of people tell me, "Wow, I didn't know it was so easy, and I didn't know there was not much difference between the recording and what they hear in the ears." So it's really a way to show the people, okay, what is the work in progress for doing a podcast.
And how do hosts face this kind of recordings? Because, I mean, in these recordings with a live audience, there's some risk, to put it some way, that you don't usually find when you are recording alone in a studio like me and you are doing right now.
Yeah, when we are in public, when we are in live audience, we try to do it like a live show with no interruption. But for my part, what I do when I do live audience, I tell to people, okay, you're listening to the raw version, so be kind. maybe sometimes I will tell my sentence again. I will ask my question again to have a nice way, and it's also for my guest. So when I think the people are very kind and very patient to accept some unpredictability. And for my part, when the audience react, like sometimes I do some live podcasting and episode with fun or funny. It's so cool to have the reaction from the audience, and for me it really add something. And the unpredictability and the live audience is really fun.
And what would you say apart from this unpredictability that it can turn something maybe something usual into some exceptional moments for the podcast? Apart from that, what would you say is the best and maybe the worst about recording a podcast with a live audience?
I'm very afraid of the technical problem. That's my main issue. I rarely have some problem, but I'm always checking the material. I'm always checking, is it okay? Sometimes I'm doing the technique myself when I'm recording in live audience, so it's very stressful to have to check everything. I'm always thinking, is it okay? Is it okay? Because if the technical part is failing, oh my God, we can do nothing. And for the rest, it's really an experience to be together that really adds something. And sometimes also it's a way to prove the importance of the podcast, to show to the people, okay, I have an audience. My audience is here, and I can mobilize and can get the people together to see me in live.
Yeah, they like my podcast so much that they have come to see it live.
And sometimes people come far away from the country, and 2 months ago, I did a live audience, and it was so emotional. I was so emotional because there was a girl. She was 15, and at the end of the live audience, at the end of the recording, she came to me and said, "Oh, hi! I convinced my parents to come because I really love the podcast. We made a 3 hours driving to come." And was like, "Oh my God, you convinced your parents to do this!" And the mother was so happy. She said she never asked for anything, but it's like the first time she asked for something as big and say, okay, let's go to see the podcast. I was like so amazed that people come so far away for this.
And I also believe, because I have also some experience producing this kind of podcasts, and from my experience, what I take as the main lesson is that a good audience, a good loyal audience, can turn a bad episode into a good one. Because maybe, obviously, we always try to do the best we can, but maybe things sometimes aren't clicking as they should. But having by your side a good audience can help even to boost the host's confidence, and that translates into a better episode. So,
yeah, totally.
The presence of audience in podcasts, Fanny, usually takes place in comedy podcasts, at least here in Spain. But could you tell me some successful examples of other genres, like, I don't know, like true crime, doing live recordings?
I'm not sure. In France, I never heard of a live audience recording podcast with true crime, except there was a festival with a lot of podcast recording, and there was a true crime. But usually in France, we have comedy podcasts. Like there was a great podcast that just finished because they were running for like 10 years. It's a podcast 2 heures de perdu. If you speak French and you like cinema and you like humor, they fulfill a big place in Paris called the Olympia. It's a really famous place. 3,000 people came to see this show in Olympia. It's a very legendary place in Paris, but they are a comedy podcast. But as you said, a lot of podcasts doing live audience make it because they have a fan base. Not especially there are comedy or other things. Maybe sometimes a testimony podcast. People talking about the experience, about feminism, about a lot of things, and also humor. But really, I'm seeing a lot of big live audience with people with big fan base, with a big Instagram account, who's making a podcast.
Mm-hmm. What do you expect from the future of live podcasts? How do you think podcasting can or will evolve in this regard?
For my part, doing live audience podcast allow people to know better about what is a podcast. Because in France, it's still sometimes a problem to say, okay, what is a podcast? But for me, it's to be seen by all the medias. So if we can get to bigger and bigger place for all podcasts, it will be very nice. And I would like to get a shout out to the festival. There is a few festivals in France who are doing live audience recording, and it's very nice. Like Podium, it's a festival who did like for 10 years live podcasting in a city of France called Rennes, and they are doing one in Paris in a few months. So shout out to them, because the technical part is sometimes very complicated, and they can allow even small podcasts to get a live audience experience.
It's often said, Fanny, and even you mentioned it before, that the intimacy between hosts and listeners, it what makes a podcast maybe succeed or part of the identity of a podcast. Do you think podcasts maybe lose part of their identity when they are recorded with a live audience?
It depends. I don't think so. Of course, not all the podcasts are good for live audience. But for me, it's really like the what I say, experience of getting together. We like to go to theater or cinema, even for very intimacy subject. So why not in podcast?
Yeah. Just this is like the big question from your experience. How do you make the recording both entertaining for the live audience and for people listening at home? How do you find that balance?
I'm always thinking about the fact that the podcast I'm recording will be listened for years and years. So I'm really always talking for the people in the audience and the people who are listening in podcast, so they don't get excluded. So for me, it's very, very important. So if there is something happening in the audience, I explain it on the mic. Say, oh, some people shout out, and I repeat. So everybody gets included. So for me, it's very, very important. And one of my, no, it's not an issue, but when I'm in live, I'm doing a lot of jokes. And sometimes I say, okay, I'm trying to not do too much, but I love to make people laugh, even if it's not at all the subject. But I'm trying to make the audience react. And I think it's working when people are listening podcasts. So I'm trying to do this.
And before we finish this episode, Fanny, I would like for you to answer the big three classic questions of Sounds Like Europe. These are regarding the podcasting industry in your country. So first of all, what would you say is the most important podcast in France right now?
In France, we can say we have two very, very important podcasts. We have one who is like I think 7 years old, 8 years old, with Transfer, where people talk about a history that happened to them, but it's very intimate, and sometimes it can be like very trigger warning about a lot of subjects. So be careful. And I would like also to talk about a podcast which is made by an influencer called Lena Situation, and the podcast is on the number one on Spotify, Canapé 6 Places, where the influencer invites guests and asks questions, and she's very, very good at it. So I'm very happy because she's followed by a lot of young people who are going to listen to podcasts. So that's a very good thing.
And when is your favorite moment to listen to podcasts?
Any moment. I'm listening to podcasts all day long. When I'm not doing my own, I'm listening to other podcasts. Really, I'm waking up, I'm in the shower, I'm doing dishes, I'm walking, I'm every time.
And just out of curiosity, Fanny, what's something that makes you stop everything you're doing and at any given moment and go listen to a podcast?
That's a very tricky question. I think when it's an old podcast who is releasing an episode and I didn't expect it. I like, oh my God, they didn't make any episode for 1 year and now they're coming back. What's going on? I want to know.
Fanny Cohen Moreau, journalist and podcast producer, thanks a lot for being here on this episode of Sounds Like Europe.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
And to everyone on the other side, I've been your host, Javi Caminero. Thank you for listening to this last episode of the first season of Sounds Like Europe. It's been a pleasure discovering the European podcasting industry with you, and I'm extremely proud of the community we have managed to create. Thanks a lot as well to everyone involved in this project, and we will be back in September with more episodes of Sounds Like Europe. Adios.
Sounds Like Europe, Cross-Border Podcasting is a WePod podcast funded by the Creative Europe programme. Hosted and written by Javi Caminero, sound design by Manu Tomillo, coordinator Alexander Damiano Ricci, executive producer Anna Ribera.